Oof, okay, that was bad timing. I hit the go live button and then immediately started coughing. Hopefully that did not come through on the stream. Good. I would have felt bad. Been like, hey everybody, I'm live. Terrible, actually. So I'm going through my Discord messages just to make sure that I got all of the answers to the giveaway questions from people. Fact is, there were not a lot. I think I'll wait a bit before I do another giveaway, just because didn't get quite the response that I thought I would. Apparently you guys don't want free games, I don't know. So we'll see how that goes. And I will announce the winner this weekend on probably the Friday stream. How are you today, Vela? Little dude in here too? Hey, Sparky. How are you? Oops, I mistitled the stream. Hey, J-Math. He's hooting and hollering with a friend. Okay. That's funny. Let me fix the stream title real quick. Oopsied. It's the clue of the twisted candle, not the tail of the twisted candle. Don't even know what book I'm reading. Edit. There we go. And I think I'm still marked as mature. Yep, there we go. All fixed. All fixed. What's up, J-Math? If you want me to make an actual guess, you got to give me slightly more context than that. I guess we're going to just keep guessing. All right. Anybody have any ideas for who murdered Kara? Any thoughts or theories you've come up with in the last week? That's not good. That sucks, man. Was the new position a bad one? Or just not like a schedule you wanted? Or yeah, that really sucks. I'm so sorry. That is not something I would have guessed. Nor would I have wanted to guess that. That really sucks, man. I'm sorry. You'd think they would have been like willing to negotiate or something a little bit, or at least tell you it's this or nothing. Oh, 4 interviews is good. Well, I tell you what, I can't do anything about the job thing except like send good wishes your way, but I can let you pick the poet today. So which poet that we've read would you like to hear from today? Tea is good. I like tea. For some reason, tea made me think of emotes. Message that guy who wanted to like help with emotes real quick. Okay, Baudelaire Yeats. And you might have, like, dropped all of the E's from Baudelaire. Apparently you just don't like E, because, yeah, that's all you did. You got it right except the E's. So after the D, it's an E, not an A, and at the end, there's another E. Like so. I don't know French either. But I have a cheat of the book right in front of me with the spelling. All right, how about one of the Parisian scenes, speaking of French? We'll do Misty Rains and then Parisian Dream. How's that sound? Hello, little dude. How are you today? Hi, Gecko. I'm glad you popped in to say hi. If you lurk, remember, mute the tab, not the channel. I learned that from Alex. Apparently, if you do that, it'll still count as a view. I mean, I'd rather you actually listened, but, you know, I know that you've got lives and stuff to do, and I can't be the sole focus of your existence as much as I'd like to be. Uh-oh, congrats. What are we congrating? I'm lost. Oh, well. Okay. Well, catch me up if you want. Otherwise, congrats for whatever we're congrating. All right, Charles Baudelaire, Mists and Rains. O inns of autumn, winters, springtimes deep in mud, seasons of drowsiness, my love and gratitude, I give you that have wrapped with mist my heart and brain, as with a shroud, and shut them in a tomb of rain. And this wide land, when coldly blows the bleak southwest, and weather vanes at night grow hoarse on the house crest, Better than in the time when green things bud and grow, my mounting soul spreads wide its black wings of a crow. The heart fills up with gloom, and to the falling sleet, long since accustomed, finds no other thing more sweet. O dismal seasons, queens of our sad climate crowned, than to remain always in your pale shadows drowned, unless it be some dark night kissing an unseen head, to rock one's pain to sleep upon a hazardous bed. A little bit dark, but I do actually really love like the rainy seasons and stuff like that, so I kind of feel them on that. Parisian Dream. That marvelous landscape of my dream, which no eye knows, nor ever will. At moments, wide awake I seem to grasp, and it excites me still. Sleep, how miraculous you are! A strange caprice has urged my hand to banish, as irregular, all vegetation from that land. And proud of what my art had done, I viewed my painting, knew the great, intoxicating monotone of marble, water, steel, and slate. Stairs and arcades there were, in a long labyrinth which led to a vast palace. Fountains there were gushing gold and gushing lead. And many a heavy cataract, hung like a curtain, did not fall, as water does, but hung compact, crystal, on many a metal wall. Tall nymphs with tightened breasts and knees gazed at their images unblurred, where groves of colonnades, not trees, fringed a deep pool where nothing stirred. Blue sheets of water, left and right, spread between keys of rose and green, to the world's end and out of sight, and still expanded, though unseen. Enchanted rivers, those with jade and jasper were their banks bedecked, enormous mirrors dazzled, made dizzy by all they did reflect. And many a Ganges, taciturn and heedless in the vaulted air, poured out the treasure of its urn into a gulf of diamond there. As architect, it tempted me to tame the ocean at its source, and this I did. I made the sea under a jeweled culvert course, and every color, even black, became prismatic, polished, bright. The liquid gave its glory back, mounted in iridescent light. There was no moon, there was no sun, for why should sun and moon conspire to light such prodigies? Each one blazed with its own essential fire. A silence like eternity prevailed, there was no sound to hear. These marvels all were for the eye, and there was nothing for the ear. I woke, my mind was bright with flame. I saw the cheap and sordid hole I live in, and my cares all came burrowing back into my soul. Brutally the 12 strokes of noon against my naked ear were hurled, and a gray sky was drizzling down upon this sad, lethargic world. Kind of rough to wake up from a dream of beauty, even if it was non-standard beauty, into the sordid little room that you are locked into in the real world. I actually have a relatively decent house to live in, but I kind of feel like that sometimes. I have a dream of like life before the pandemic, or going out somewhere or meeting with friends, and then I wake up and it's like, nope, I'm just stuck. SCP? That's not that creepy pasta stuff, is it? All right. Well, unless anybody has any theories on the murderer, I guess we'll jump into the story. We are going to be doing chapter 16. Well, that's how I think of it, as the creepypasta, but it's like collection of new and old urban legends and scary stories and weirdness, right? Like, not to be reductive or dismissive, but like that sort of thing thematically, I guess. All right. Chapter 16. February as a rule. Wait. Yep, okay. February, as a rule, is not a month of fogs, but rather a month of tempestuous gales, of frosts and snowfalls. But the night of February 17th, 1900s, was one of calm and mist. It was not the typical London fog, so dreaded by the foreigner, but one of those little patchy mists which smoke through the streets, now enshrouding and making the nearest object invisible, now clearing away to the finest diaphanous filament of pale gray. Right, but that's like the framing. Like some movies or TV shows will have a framing device like that for like an anthology type of deal where they show a bunch of different sort of related stories. But, each is its own individual story. Sir William Bartholomew had a house in Portman Place, which is a wide thoroughfare, filled with solemn edifices of unlovely and forbidding exterior, but remarkably comfortable within. Shortly before 11 on the night of February the 17th, a taxi drew up at the junction of Sussex Street and Portman Place, and a girl alighted. The fog at that moment was denser than usual, and she hesitated a moment before she left the shelter which the cab afforded. She gave the driver a few instructions and walked on with a firm step, turning abruptly and mounting the steps of number 173. Very quickly she inserted her key in the lock, pushed the door open, and closed it behind her. She switched on the hall light. The house sounded hollow and deserted, a fact which afforded her considerable satisfaction. She turned the light out and found her way up the broad stairs to the first floor, paused for a moment to switch on another light, which she knew would not be observable from the street outside, and mounted the second flight. Miss Belinda Mary Bartholomew congratulated herself upon the success of her scheme, and the only doubt that was in her mind now was whether the boudoir had been locked, but her father was rather careless in such matters, and Jax the butler was one of those dear, silly old men who never locked anything, and in consequence faced every audit with a long face, and a longer tale of the peculations of occasional servants. I don't think that it's that Mulder wasn't taken seriously. I think it's that he was at odds with the people who did take it seriously on what to do about it. To her immense relief, the handle turned and the door opened to her touch. Somebody had had the sense to pull down the blinds, and the curtains were drawn. She switched on the light with a sigh of relief. Her mother's writing table was covered with unopened letters, but she brushed these aside in her search for the little parcel. It was not there, and her heart sank. Perhaps she had put it in one of the drawers. She tried them all without result. She stood by the desk, a picture of perplexity, biting a finger thoughtfully. "Thank goodness," she said with a jump, for she saw the parcel on the mantel-shelf, crossed the room and took it down. With eager hands she tore off the covering and came to the familiar leather case. Not until she had opened the padded lid and had seen the snuff-box reposing in a bed of cotton wool did she relapse into a long sigh of relief. "Thank heaven for that," she said aloud. "And me," said a voice. She sprang up and turned round with a look of terror. Mr. Meredith," she stammered. T.X. stood by the window curtains from whence he had made his dramatic entry upon the scene. "I say you have to thank me also, Miss Bartholomew," he said presently. "How do you know my name?" she asked with some curiosity. I know everything in the world, he answered, and she smiled. Suddenly, her face went serious, and she demanded sharply, "Who sent you after me? Mr. Kara?" "Mr. Kara," he repeated in wonder. "He threatened to send for the police," she went on rapidly, "and I told him he might do so. I didn't mind the police. It was Kara I was afraid of. You know what I went for. My mother's property." She held the snuff box in her outstretched hand. "He accused me of stealing and was hateful, and then he put me downstairs in that awful cellar and—" "And?" suggested TX. "That's all," she replied with tightened lips. "What are you going to do now?" "I am going to ask you a few questions, if I may," he said. "In the first place, have you not heard anything about Mr. Kara since you went away?" She shook her head. "I have kept out of his way," she said grimly. "Have you seen the newspapers?" he asked. "I've seen the advertisement column. I wired asking Papa to reply to my telegram." "I know. I saw it," he smiled. "That is what brought me here." "I was afraid it would," she said ruefully. "Father is awfully loquacious in print. He makes speeches, you know. All I wanted him to say was yes or no. What do you mean about the newspapers?" she went on. Is anything wrong with Mother?" He shook his head. "So far as I know, Lady Bartholomew is in the best of health and is on her way home." "Then what do you mean by asking me about the newspapers?" she demanded. "Why should I see the newspapers? What is there for me to see?" "About Kara," he suggested. She shook her head in bewilderment. "I know and want to know nothing about Kara. Why do you say this to me?" "Because," said TX slowly, "on the night you disappeared from Cadogan Square, Remington Kara was murdered." "Murdered?" she gasped. He nodded. "He was stabbed to the heart by some person or persons unknown." TX took his hand from his pocket and pulled something out which was wrapped in tissue paper. This he carefully removed, and the girl watched with fascinated gaze and with an awful sense of apprehension. Presently the object was revealed. It was a pair of scissors, with the handle wrapped about with a small handkerchief, dappled with brown stains. She took a step backward, raising her hands to her cheeks. "My scissors," she said huskily. "You won't think." She stared up at him, fear and indignation struggling for mastery. "I don't think you committed the murder," he smiled, "if that's what you mean to ask me. But if anybody else found those scissors and had identified this handkerchief, you would have been rather a fix, my young friend." She looked at the scissors and shuddered. "I did something," she said in a low voice. "An awful dog. I don't know how I did it, but the beastly thing jumped at me, and I just stabbed him and killed him, and I'm glad." She nodded many times and repeated, "I am glad." "So I gather. I found the dog, and now perhaps you'll explain why I didn't find you." Again she hesitated, and he felt that she was hiding something from him. "I don't know why you didn't find me," she said. "I was there." "How did you get out?" "How did you get out?" she challenged him boldly. "I got out through the door," he confessed. "It seems a ridiculously commonplace way of leaving, but that's the only way I could see." "And that's how I got out," she answered, with a little smile. "But it was locked." She laughed. "I see now," she said. "I was in the cellar. I heard your key in the lock and bolted down the trap, leaving those awful scissors behind. I thought it was Kara with some of his friends, and then the voices died away, and I ventured to come up, and found you had left the door open, so I—" These queer little pauses puzzled TX. There was something she was not telling him, something she had yet to reveal. "So I got away, you see," she went on. "I came out into the kitchen. There was nobody there, and I passed through the area door and up the steps, and just round the corner I found a taxicab, and that is all." She spread out her hands in a dramatic little gesture. "That is all, is it?" said TX. "That is all," she repeated. "Now, what are you going to do?" TX looked up at the ceiling and stroked his chin. "I suppose that I ought to arrest you. I feel that something is due from me. May I ask if you were sleeping in the bed downstairs?" "In the little cellar?" she demanded. A little pause, and then, "Yes, I was sleeping in the cellar downstairs." There was that interval of hesitation almost between each word. "What are you going to do?" she asked again. She was feeling more sure of herself and had suppressed the panic which his sudden appearance had produced in her. He rumpled his hair, a gross imitation, did she but know it, of one of his chief's mannerisms, and she observed that his hair was very thick and inclined to curl. She saw also that he was passably good-looking, had fine gray eyes, a straight nose, and a most firm chin. "I think," she suggested gently, "you had better arrest me." "Don't be silly," he begged. She stared at him in amazement. "What did you say?" she asked wrathfully. "I said, don't be silly," repeated the calm young man. "Do you know that you're being very rude?" she asked. He seemed interested and surprised at this novel view of his conduct. "Of course," she went on carefully, smoothing her dress and avoiding his eye, "I know you think I am silly and that I've got a most comic name." "I have never said your name was comic," he replied coldly. "I would not take so great a liberty." "You said it was weird, which was worse," she claimed. "I may have said it was weird," he admitted, "but that's rather different to saying it was comic. There's dignity in weird things. For example, nightmares aren't comic, but they're weird." "Thank you," she said pointedly. "Yeah, don't call her a nightmare. Not unless you mean to, charge her with murder, I suppose." "Not that I mean your name is anything approaching a nightmare." He made this concession with a most magnificent sweep of the hand, as though he were a king conceding her the right to remain covered in his presence. "And I think that Belinda Mary," she corrected. "Belinda Mary, I was going to say. Or as a matter of fact, I was going to say Belinda and Mary." "You were going to say nothing of the kind," she corrected him. "Anyway, I think Belinda Mary is a very pretty name." "You think nothing of the sort." She saw the laughter in his eyes and felt an insane desire to laugh. "You said it was a weird name, and you think it is a weird name, but I really can't be bothered considering everybody's views. I think it's a weird name, too. It was named after an aunt," she added in self-defense. "There you have the advantage of me," he inclined his head politely. "I was named after my father's favorite dog." "What does TX stand for?" she asked curiously. "Thomas Xavier," he said, and she leant back in the big chair on the edge of which, a few minutes before, she had perched herself in trepidation, and dissolved into a fit of immoderate laughter. "It is comic, isn't it?" he asked. "Oh, I am sorry I'm so rude," she gasped. "Fancy being called Tommy Xavier. I mean Thomas Xavier." "You may call me Tommy if you wish. Most of my friends do." "Unfortunately, I'm not your friend," she said, still smiling, and wiping the tears from her eyes. "So I shall go on calling you Mr. Meredith, if you don't mind." She looked at her watch. "If you are not going to arrest me, I'm going," she said. "I have certainly no intention of arresting you," said he, "but I am going to see you home." She jumped up smartly. "You're not," she commanded. She was so definite in this that he was startled. "My dear child," he protested. "Please don't dear child me," she said seriously. "You're going to be a good little Tommy and let me go home by myself." She held out her hand frankly, and the laughing appeal in her eyes was irresistible. "Well, I'll see you to a cab," he insisted. "And listen while I give the driver instructions where he is to take me." She shook her head reprovingly. It must be an awful thing to be a policeman. He stood back with folded arms, a stern frown on his face. "Don't you trust me?" he asked. "No," she replied. "Quite right," he approved. "Anyway, I'll see you to the cab, and you can tell the driver to go to Charing Cross Station, and on your way you can change your direction." "And you promise you won't follow me?" she asked. "On my honor," he swore. "On one condition, though." "I will make no conditions," she replied haughtily. "Please come down from your great big horse," he begged, "and listen to reason. The condition I make is that I can always bring you to an appointed rendezvous whenever I want you. Honestly, this is necessary, Belinda Mary." "Miss Bartholomew," she corrected, coldly. "It is necessary," he went on, "as you will understand. Promise me that, if I put an advertisement in the agonies of either an evening paper, which I will name, or in the Morning Port, You will keep the appointment I fix, if it is humanly possible. She hesitated a moment, then held out her hand. I promise, she said. Good for you, Belinda Mary, said he, and tucking her arm in his, he led her out of the room, switching off the light and racing her down the stairs. If there was a lot of the schoolgirl left in Belinda Mary Bartholomew, no less of the schoolboy was there in this commissioner of police. He would have danced her through the fog, contemptuous of the proprieties, but he wasn't so very anxious to get her to her cab and to lose sight of her. Good night, he said, holding her hand. That's the third time you've shaken hands with me tonight, she interjected. Don't let us have any unpleasantness at the last, he pleaded. And remember, I have promised, she replied. And one day, he went on, you will tell me all that happened in that cellar. I have told you, she said in a low voice. You have not told me everything, child. He handed her into the cab. He shut the door behind her and leant through the open window. Victoria or Marble Arch, he asked politely. Charing Cross, she replied, with a little laugh. He watched the cab drive away, and then suddenly it stopped, and a figure leant out from the window, beckoning him frantically. He ran up to her. Suppose I want you, she asked. Advertise, he said promptly, beginning your advertisement, Dear Tommy. I shall put TX, she said indignantly. Then I shall take no notice of your advertisement, he replied, and stood in the middle of the street, his hat in his hand, to the intense annoyance of a taxicab driver who literally all but ran him down, and in a figurative sense did so until TX was out of earshot. Yeah, not flirting at all. What is it with these old school detectives and like hitting on the suspects? Chapter 17. I'm starting to think it's like a type. Like there were character archetypes that used to be used in a lot of like old stories and plays and productions, where once you established that something was a particular archetype, the audience was already familiar with it. So you got a lot of kind of gimmies, like things that you could assume were common knowledge. And so you didn't have to spend that time introducing those concepts. Sort of like faster than light travel is a gimme in science fiction novels today, right? I mean, Agatha Christie is a pretty great mystery writer, and she had a character like that. So I don't know if you can say only the not great ones. And TX is certainly presented as some sort of great investigator, although I have yet to see real signs of it. Chapter 17. Thomas Xavier Meredith was a shrewd young man. It was said of him by Signor Paolo Coselli, the eminent criminologist, that he had a gift of intuition which was abnormal. Probably the mystery of the twisted candle was solved by him long before any other person in the world had the dimmest idea that it was capable of solution. The house in Cadogan Square was still in the hands of the police. Hey, Zhivago, welcome. Welcome. Glad to see you here. I haven't seen you in a while, my friend. How did your exams go? I hope they went well. Yes, more often is good. To this house, and particularly to Kara's bedroom, TX from time to time repaired, and reproduced as far as possible the conditions which obtained on the night of the murder. He had the same stifling fire, the same locked door. The latch was dropped in its socket, whilst TX, with a stopwatch in his hand, made elaborate calculations, and acted certain parts which he did not reveal to a soul. 10 out of 10 would bonk again. 3 times, accompanied by Mansus, he went to the house. 3 times went to the death chamber, and was alone on one occasion for an hour and a half, whilst the patient Mansus waited outside. 3 times he emerged looking graver on each occasion, and after the 3rd visit he called into consultation John Lexman. Lexman had been spending some time in the country, having deferred his trip to the United States. "This case puzzles me more and more, John," said TX, troubled out of his usual boisterous self. "And thank heaven it worries other people besides me. De Manow came over from France the other day, and brought all his best sleuths, whilst O'Grady of the New York Central Office paid a flying visit just to get hold of the facts. Not one of them has given me the real solution, though they've all been rather ingenious. Gathercole has vanished, and is probably on his way to some undiscoverable region, and our people have not yet traced the valet. He should be the easiest for you," said John Lexman reflectively. "Why Gathercole should go off, I can't understand," TX continued. "According to the story which was told me by Fisher, his last words to Kara were to the effect that he was expecting a check, or that he had received a check. No check has been presented or drawn, and apparently Gathercole has gone off without waiting for any payment. An examination of Kara's books showed nothing against the Gathercole account, save the sum of £600 which was originally advanced. And now, to upset all my calculations, look at this." He took from his pocketbook a newspaper cutting and pushed it across the table, for they were dining together at the Carlton. John Lexman picked up the slip and read. It was evidently from a New York paper. "Further news has now come to hand by the Antarctic Trading Company's steamer, Cyprus, concerning the wreck of the City of the Argentine. It is believed that this ill-fated vessel, which called at South American ports, lost her propeller and drifted south out of the track of shipping. This theory is now confirmed. Apparently the ship struck an iceberg on December 23rd and foundered with all aboard save a few men who were able to launch a boat and who were picked up by the Cyprus. The following is the passenger list." John Lexman ran down the list until he came upon the name which was evidently underlined in ink by TX. That name was George Gathercole, and after it in brackets, Explorer. If that were true, then Gathercole could not have come to London. "He may have taken another boat," said TX, "and I cabled to the steamship company without any great success. Apparently Gathercole was an eccentric sort of man, and lived in terror of being overcrowded. It was a habit of his to make provisional bookings by every available steamer. The company can tell me no more than that he had booked, but whether he shipped on the City of the Argentine or not, they do not know." "I can tell you this about Gathercole," said John slowly and thoughtfully, "that he was a man who would not hurt a fly. He was incapable of killing any man, being constitutionally averse to taking life in any shape. For this reason, he never made collections of butterflies or of bees, and I believe has never shot an animal in his life. He carried his principles to such an extent that he was a vegetarian. Poor old Gathercole," he said, with the first smile which TX had seen on his face since he came back. "If you want to sympathize with anybody," said TX gloomily, "sympathize with me." On the following day, TX was summoned to the Home Office and went steeled for a most unholy row. The Home Secretary, a large and worthy gentleman, given to the making of speeches on every excuse, received him, however, with unusual kindness. "I've sent for you, Mr. Meredith," he said, "about this unfortunate Greek. I've had all his private papers looked into, and translated, and in some cases decoded, because, as you are probably aware, his diaries and a great deal of his correspondence were in a code which called for the attention of experts." TX had not troubled himself greatly about Kara's private papers, but had handed them over, in accordance with instructions, to the proper authorities. "Of course, Mr. Meredith," the Home Secretary went on, beaming across his big table, "we expect you to continue your search for the murderer. But I must confess that your prisoner, when you secure him, will have a very excellent case to put to a jury." "That I can well believe, sir," said TX. "Seldom in my long career at the bar," began the Home Secretary in his best oratorical manner, "have I examined a record so utterly discreditable as that of the deceased man." Here he advanced a few instances which surprised even TX. "The man was a lunatic," continued the Home Secretary, "a vicious, evil man who loved cruelty for cruelty's sake. We have in this diary alone sufficient evidence to convict him of 3 separate murders, one of which was committed in this country. TX looked his astonishment. You will remember, Mr. Meredith, as I saw in one of your reports, that he had a chauffeur, a Greek named Poropoulos. TX nodded. He went to Greece on the day following the shooting of Vassalaro, he said. The Home Secretary shook his head. He was killed on the same night, said the minister, and you will have no difficulty in finding what remains of his body in the disused house which Kara rented for his own purpose on the Portsmouth Road. That he has killed a number of people in Albania, you may well suppose. Whole villages have been wiped out to provide him with a little excitement. The man was a Nero, without any of Nero's amiable weaknesses. He was obsessed with the idea that he himself was in danger of assassination, and saw an enemy even in his trusty servant. Undoubtedly, the chauffeur Poropoulos was in touch with several continental government circles. You understand, said the minister in conclusion, that I am telling you this, not with the idea of expecting you to relax your efforts to find the murderer and clear up the mystery, but in order that you may know something of the possible motive for this man's murder. TX spent an hour going over the decoded diary and documents and left the Home Office a little shakily. It was inconceivable, incredible. Kara was a lunatic, but the directing genius was a devil. TX had a flat in Whitehall Gardens, and thither he repaired to change for dinner. He was half-dressed when the evening paper arrived, and he glanced, as was his wont, first at the news page, and then at the advertisement column. He looked down the column marked personal, without expecting to find anything of particular interest to himself, but saw that which made him drop the paper and fly round the room in a frenzy to complete his toilet. Tommy X, ran the brief announcement. Most urgent. Marble Arch 8. He had 5 minutes to get there, but it seemed like 5 hours. He was held up at almost every crossing, and though he might have used his authority to obtain right-of-way, it was a step which his curious sense of honesty prevented him taking. He leapt out of the cab before it stopped, thrust the fare into the driver's hands, and looked round for the girl. He saw her at last, and walked quickly toward her. As he approached her, she turned about, and with an almost imperceptible beckoning gesture, walked away. He followed her along the Bayswater Road, and gradually drew level. I'm afraid I have been watched, she said in a low voice. Will you call a cab? He hailed a passing taxi, helped her in, and gave at random the first place that suggested itself to him, which was Finsbury Park. I'm very worried, she said. I don't know anybody who can help me except you. Is it money? He asked. Money, she said scornfully. Of course it isn't money. I want to show you a letter, she said after a while. She took it from her bag and gave it to him, and he struck a match and read it with difficulty. It was written in a studiously uneducated hand. Dear Miss, I know who you are. You are wanted by the police, but I will not give you away. Dear Miss, I am very hard up, and £20 will be very useful to me, and I shall not trouble you again. Dear Miss, put the money on the window-sill of your room. I know you sleep on the ground floor, and I will come in and take it. And if not, well, I don't want to make any trouble. Yours truly, a friend. This does not sound like the letter of a friend. When did you get this? He asked. This morning, she replied. I sent the agony to the paper by telegram. I knew you would come. Oh, you did you? He said. Her assurance was very pleasing to him. The faith that her words implied gave him an odd little feeling of comfort and happiness. I can easily get you out of this, he added. Give me your address, and when the gentleman comes... That is impossible, she replied hurriedly. Please don't think I'm ungrateful, and don't think I'm being silly. You do think I'm being silly, don't you? I have never harbored such an unworthy thought, he said virtuously. Yes, you have, she persisted. But really, I can't tell you where I am living. I have a very special reason for not doing so. It's not myself that I'm thinking about, but there's a life involved. This was a somewhat dramatic statement to make, and she felt she had gone too far. Perhaps I don't mean that, she said. But there is someone I care for. She dropped her voice. Oh, said TX blankly. He came down from his rosy heights into the shadow and darkness of a sunless valley. Wow, he really is Hastings, isn't he? Someone you care for, he repeated after a while. Yes. There was another long silence then. Oh, indeed, said TX. Again the unbroken interval of quiet, and after a while she said in a low voice, Not that way. Not what way? Asked TX huskily, his spirits doing a little mountaineering. The way you mean, she said. Oh, said TX. He was back again amidst the rosy snows of dawn, and was in fact climbing a dizzy escalier on the topmost height of Hope's Mont Blanc when she pulled the ladder from under him. I shall, of course, never marry, she said with a certain prim decision. TX fell with a dull, sickening thud, discovering that his rosy snows were not unlike cold, hard ice in their lack of resilience. All right, J-Math, we'll see you later. Thanks for the lurk. Glad you popped in for a bit, and good luck with the interviews. Who said you would? He asked somewhat feebly, but in self-defense. You did, she said, and her audacity took his breath away. Well, how am I to help you? He asked after a while. By giving me some advice, she said. Do you think I ought to put the money there? Indeed I do not, said TX, recovering some of his natural dominance. Apart from the fact that you would be compounding a felony, you would merely be laying out trouble for yourself in the future. If he can get £20 so easily, he will come for £40. But why do you stay away? Why don't you return home? There's no charge and no breath of suspicion against you. Because I have something to do which I have set my mind to, she said, with determination in her tones. Surely you can trust me with your address, he urged her. After all that has passed between us, Belinda Mary, after all the years we have known one another. I shall get out and leave you, she said steadily. But how the dickens am I going to help you, he protested. Don't swear. She could be very severe indeed. The only way you can help me is by being kind and sympathetic. Would you like me to burst into tears? He asked sarcastically. I ask you to do nothing more painful or repugnant to your natural feelings than to be a gentleman, she said. Thank you very kindly, said TX, and leant back in the cab with an air of supreme resignation. I believe you're making faces in the dark, she accused him. God forbid that I should do anything so low, said he hastily. What made you think that? Because I was putting my tongue out at you, she admitted, and the taxi driver heard the shrieks of laughter in the cab behind him, above the wheezing of his asthmatic engine. At 12 that night, in a certain suburb of London, an overcoated man moved stealthily through a garden. He felt his way carefully along the wall of the house, and groped with hope, but with no great certainty, along the window-sill. He found an envelope, which his fingers, somewhat sensitive from long employment and nefarious uses, told him contained nothing more substantial than a letter. He went back through the garden and rejoined his companion, who was waiting under an adjacent lamp-post. Did she drop? Asked the other eagerly. I don't know yet, growled the man from the garden. He opened the envelope and read the few lines. She hasn't got the money, he said, but she's going to get it. I must meet her tomorrow afternoon at the corner of Oxford Street and Regent Street. What time? Said the other. 6 o'clock, said the first man. The chap who takes the money must carry a copy of the Westminster Gazette in his hand. Oh, then it's a plant, said the other with conviction. The other laughed. She won't work any plants. I bet she's scared out of her life. The second man bit his nails, looked up and down the road apprehensively. It's come to something, he said bitterly, when we went out to make our thousands, and we've come down to chanting for £20. It's the luck, said the other philosophically, and I haven't done with her by any means. Besides, we've still got a chance of pulling of the big thing, Harry. I reckon she's good for 100 or 2 anyway. At 6 o'clock on the following afternoon, a man dressed in a dark overcoat, with a soft felt hat pulled down over his eyes, stood nonchalantly by the curb near where the buses stop at Regent Street, slapping his hand gently with a folded copy of the Westminster Gazette. That none should mistake his liberal reading, he stood as near as possible to his street lamp, and so arranged himself in his attitude that the minimum of light should fall upon his face, and the maximum upon that respectable organ of public opinion. Soon after 6, he saw the girl approaching, out of the tail of his eye, and strolled off to meet her. To his surprise, she passed him by, and he was turning to follow when an unfriendly hand gripped him by the arm. "Mr. Fisher, I believe," said a pleasant voice. "What do you mean?" said the man, struggling backward. "Are you going quietly?" asked the pleasant Superintendent Mansus, "or shall I take my stick to you?" Mr. Fisher thought a while. "It's a cop," he confessed, and allowed himself to be hustled into the waiting cab. He made his appearance in TX's office, and that urbane gentleman greeted him as a friend. "And how is Mr. Fisher?" he asked. "I suppose you are Mr. Fisher still, and not Mr. Harry Gilcott or Mr. George Porton." Fisher smiled his old, deferential, deprecating smile. "You will always have your jokes, sir. I suppose the young lady gave me away." "You gave yourself away, my poor Fisher," said TX, and put a strip of paper before him. "You may disguise your hand, and in your extreme modesty pretend to an ignorance of the British language, which is not creditable to your many attainments. But what you must be awfully careful in doing in future, when you write such epistles," he said, "is to wash your hands." "Wash my hands?" repeated the puzzled Fisher. TX nodded. "You see, you left a little thumbprint, and we are rather whales on thumbprints at Scotland Yard, Fisher." "I see. What is the charge now, sir?" "I shall make no charge against you, except the conventional one of being a convict under license and failing to report." Fisher heaved a sigh. "That'll only mean 12 months. Are you going to charge me with this business?" He nodded to the paper. TX shook his head. "I bear you no ill will, although you tried to frighten Miss Bartholomew." "Oh, yes, I know it is Miss Bartholomew, and I have known all the time. The lady is there for a reason which is no business of yours or of mine. I shall not charge you with attempt to blackmail, and in reward for my leniency, I hope you are going to tell me all you know about the Carra murder. You wouldn't like me to charge you with that, would you, by any chance?" Fisher drew a long breath. "No, sir, but if you did, I could prove my innocence," he said earnestly. "I spent the whole of the evening in the kitchen." "Except a quarter hour," said TX. The man nodded. "That's true, sir. I went out to see a pal of mine." "The man who is in this?" asked TX. Fisher hesitated. "Yes, sir. He was with me in this, but there was nothing wrong about the business, as far as we went. I don't mind admitting that I was planning a big thing. I'm not going to blow on it, if it's going to get me into trouble. But if you'll promise me that it won't, I'll tell you the whole story." "Against whom was this coup of yours planned?" "Against Mr. Carra, sir," said Fisher. "Go on with your story," nodded DX. The story was a short and commonplace one. Fisher had met a man who knew another man who was either a Turk or an Albanian. They had learnt that Carra was in the habit of keeping large sums of money in the house, and they had planned to rob him. That was the story in a nutshell. Somewhere the plan miscarried. It was when he came to the instance that occurred on the night of the murder that TX followed him with the greatest interest. "The old gentleman came in," said Fisher, "and I saw him up to the room. I heard him coming out, and I went up and spoke to him while he was having a chat with Mr. Carra at the open door." "Did you hear Mr. Carra speak?" "I fancy I did, sir," said Fisher. "Anyway, the old gentleman was quite pleased with himself." "Why do you say old gentleman?" asked TX. "He was not an old man." "Not exactly, sir," said Fisher, "but he had a sort of fussy, irresistible way that old gentlemen sometimes have, and I somehow got it fixed in my mind that he was old. As a matter of fact, he was about 45. He may have been 50. "You've told me all this before. Was there anything peculiar about him?" Fisher hesitated. "Nothing, sir, except the fact that one of his arms was a game one." Meaning that it was an artificial one, sir, so far as I can make out." "Was it his right or his left arm that was game?" interrupted TX. "His left arm, sir." "You're sure?" "I'd swear to it, sir." "Very well, go on." "He came downstairs and went out, and I never saw him again. When you came and the murder was discovered, and knowing as I did that I had my own scheme on and that one of your splits might pinch me, I got a bit rattled. I went downstairs to the hall, and the first thing I saw lying on the table was a letter. It was addressed to me." He paused And TX nodded. Go on, he said again. I couldn't understand how it came to be there, but as I'd been in the kitchen most of the evening, except when I was seeing my pal outside to tell him the job was off for that night, it might have been there before you came. I opened the letter. There were only a few words on it. I can tell you those few words made my heart jump up into my mouth and made me go cold all over. What were they? Asked TX. I shall never forget them, sir. They're sort of permanently fixed in my brain, said the man earnestly. The note started with just the figures AC274. What was that? Asked TX. My convict number when I was in Dartmoor prison, sir. What did the note say? Get out of here quick. I don't know who had put it there, but I'd evidently been spotted, and I was taking no chances. That's the whole story from beginning to end. I accidentally happened to meet the young lady, Miss Holland, Miss Bartholomew as she is, and followed her to her house in Portman Place. That was the night you were there. TX found himself to his intense annoyance, going very red. And you know no more? He asked. No more, sir. And if I may be struck dead, keep all that Sabbath talk for the chaplain, commended TX. And they took away Mr. Fisher, not an especially dissatisfied man. That night, TX interviewed his prisoner at Cannon Row Police Station and made a few more inquiries. There is one thing I would like to ask you, said the girl when he met her next morning in Green Park. If you were going to ask whether I made inquiries as to where your habitation was, he warned her, I beg of you to refrain. She was looking very beautiful that morning, he thought. The keen air had brought a color to her face and lent a spring to her gait, and as she strode along by his side with the free and careless swing of youth, she was an epitome of the life which even now was budding on every tree in the park. Your father is back in town, by the way, he said, and he is most anxious to see you. She made a little grimace. I hope you haven't been round talking to father about me. Of course I have, he said helplessly. I have also had all the reporters up from Fleet Street and given them a full description of your escapades. She looked round at him with laughter in her eyes. You have all the manners of an early Christian martyr, she said. Poor soul, would you like to be thrown to the lions? I should prefer being thrown to the dimnition ducks and drakes, he said moodily. You're such a miserable man, she chided him, and yet you have everything to make life worth living. Ha ha, said TX. You have. Of course you have. You have a splendid position. Everybody looks up to you and talks about you. You've got a wife and family who adore you. He stopped and looked at her as though she were some strange insect. I have a how much? He asked credulously. Aren't you married? She asked innocently. He made a strange noise in his throat. Do you know, I have always thought of you as married, she went on. I often picture you in your domestic circle, reading to the children from the Daily Megaphone those awfully interesting stories about Little Willie Waterbug. He held on to the railings for support. May we sit down? He asked faintly. She sat by his side, half turned to him, demure and wholly adorable. Of course, you are right in one respect, he said at last, but you're altogether wrong about the children. Are you married? She demanded, with no evidence of amusement. Didn't you know? He asked. She swallowed something. Of course, it's no business of mine, and I'm sure I hope you are very happy. Perfectly happy, said TX complacently. You must come out and see me one Saturday afternoon when I am digging the potatoes. I am a perfect devil when they let me loose in the vegetable garden. Shall we go on? She said. He could have sworn there were tears in her eyes, and, manlike, he thought she was vexed with him at his fooling. I haven't made you cross, have I? He asked. Oh, no, she replied. I mean, you don't believe all this rot about my being married and that sort of thing. I'm not interested, she said, with a shrug of her shoulders. Not very much. You've been very kind to me, and I should be an awful bore if I wasn't grateful. Of course I don't care whether you're married or not. It's nothing to do with me, is it? Naturally he isn't, he replied. I suppose you aren't married by any chance? Married, she replied bitterly. Why, you will make my fourth. She had hardly got the words out of her mouth before she realized her terrible error. A second later she was in his arms, and he was kissing her to keep the scandal of one aged park keeper, one small and dirty-faced little boy and a molting duck who seemed to sneer at the proceedings, which he watched through a yellow and malignant eye. "Belinda Mary," said TX at parting, "you've got to give up your little country establishment, wherever it may be, and come back to the discomforts of Portman Place. Oh, I know you can't come back yet. That somebody is there, and I can pretty well guess who it is." "Who?" she challenged. "I rather fancy your mother has come back," he suggested. A look of scorn dawned into her pretty face. "Good Lord, Tommy," she said in disgust. "You don't think I should keep Mother in the suburbs without her telling the world all about it?" "You're an undutiful little beggar," he said. They had reached the Horse Guards at Whitehall, and he was saying goodbye to her. Yeah, Duck better not say shit, or he's going to get roasted. "If it comes to a matter of duty," she answered, "perhaps you will do your duty and hold up the traffic for me and let me cross this road." "My dear girl," he protested, "hold up the traffic?" "Of course," she said indignantly. "You're a policeman." "Only when I'm in uniform," he said hastily, and piloted her across the road. It was a new man who returned to the gloomy office in Whitehall, a man with a heart that swelled and throbbed with the pride and joy of life's most precious possession. I'll take a short intermission there. I don't think it's his heart that was swelling and throbbing after that, though. It was clearly his head that was swollen and throbbing, as he was quite full of himself. What, he's never heard of somebody having a swollen head? Getting full of themselves? Thinking they're hot stuff? What did you think I meant? Speaking of, I need to take off my hoodie. Getting too warm. Start these streams all cold and chilly, and so I wear the hoodie, and then I drink warm tea or hot tea throughout. Hey now, little eyes. Not just little ears. Anyway, I start all like cold, and so I wear the hoodie to keep warm, and then I drink all the hot tea and get overheated. So, I'm thinking it is whoever Gathercole was, whether it was actually Gathercole or not. Money can be used for the purchase of goods or services. It can also be donated to support causes or actions, all sorts of things. It can pay off blackmailers. It can buy dino nuggies and have them shipped to you from all over the world. All kinds of crazy things can be done with money. The question is, what goods and services were being requested by that $1 bill? And was that the proper valuation for it? Gonna laugh my butt off. It says to ask Vela. Better not tell you now, huh? Okay. trolling Vela? Yes. Look at that. There you go, Vela. 8-Ball says it's trolling you. I am. Do I need to add a take the hoodie off tier to it with a special reward? But in all seriousness, yes, you are supporting me on Patreon, and I am extremely grateful for it. I really do appreciate it. So Vela, what do you think? Should the hoodie be removable for a reasonable price? I mean, Streamlabs does have the option to tip, so maybe there could be a take the hoodie off tip level. And what is Rabble Rabble? I don't understand what that question was. 8-Ball didn't either, since he didn't put the exclamation mark. Oops. Messing up his work call. Shame, shame. All right, let's see. Oh, okay. So Rabble Rabble was standing in for some inappropriate words and language, I take it. I got it. Well, let's see. One last question for 8-Ball, and then we'll get back to it. Oh, the snark. Rabble Rabble could stand in for Gur, I suppose. I mean, if it was Gur, I'd really expect the Doom song. I missed that show. Maybe if they are doing all these reboots, they'll reboot that one. Or continue it. Speaking of, has anybody watched the Animaniacs reboot? That thing is awesome so far. I love it. They brought back Animaniacs. They brought back Pinky and the Brain. With the original voice actors and stuff. It's awesome. Seems like it's some of the same writing team and stuff too. Get rid of that follower goal. We'll do another one of those soon. Be still your heart? Why be still your heart? All right, chapter 18. TX. One second. All right, let's try that again. I had a catch in my throat. TX sat at his desk, his chin in his hands, his mind remarkably busy. Grave as the matter was which he was considering, he rose with alacrity to meet the smiling girl who was ushered through the door by Mansus, preternaturally solemn and mysterious. She was radiant that day. Her eyes were sparkling with an unusual brightness. "I've got the most wonderful thing to tell you," she said, "and I can't tell you." "That's a very good beginning," said TX, taking her muff from her hand. Wow, that's forward for at work, taking her muff from her hand. Oh, but it's really wonderful, she cried eagerly. More wonderful than anything you have ever heard about. We're interested, said TX blandly. No, you mustn't make fun, she begged. I can't tell you now, but it is something that will make you simply... She was at a loss for a simile. Jump out of my skin, suggested TX. I shall astonish you, she nodded her head solemnly. I take a lot of astonishing, I warn you, he smiled. To know you is to exhaust one's capacity for surprise. That can be either very, very nice or very, very nasty, she said cautiously. But accept it as being very, very nice, he laughed. Now, come, out with this tale of yours. She shook her head very vigorously. I can't possibly tell you anything, she said. Then why the dickens do you begin telling anything for? He complained, not without reason. Because I just want you to know that I do know something. Oh, Lord, he groaned. Of course you know everything. Belinda Mary, you're really the most wonderful child. He sat on the edge of her armchair and laid his hand on her shoulder. And you've come to take me out to lunch. What were you worrying about when I came in? She asked. He made a little gesture as if to dismiss the subject. Nothing very much. You've heard me speak of John Lexman. She bent her head. Lexman's the writer of a great many mystery stories, but you probably read his books. She nodded again, and again TX noticed the suppressed eagerness in her eyes. You're not ill or sickening for anything, are you? He asked anxiously. Measles or mumps or something? Don't be silly, she said. Go on and tell me something about Mr. Lexman. He is going to America, said TX, and before he goes, he wants to give a little lecture. A lecture? It sounds rum, doesn't it? But that's just what he wants to do. Why is he doing it? She asked. TX made a gesture of despair. That is one of the mysteries which may never be revealed to me, except... He pursed his lips and looked thoughtfully at the girl. There are times, he said, when there is a great struggle going on inside a man, between all the human and better parts of him, and the baser professional part of him. One side of me wants to hear this lecture of John Lexman's very much. The other shrinks from the ordeal. Let us talk it over at lunch, she said practically, and carried him off. Chapter 14. 19. Apparently I can't read Roman numerals today. One would not readily associate the party of top-booted sewermen who descend nightly to the subterranean passages of London with the stout vice-consul at Durazzo. Yet it was one unimaginative man who lived in Lambeth and had no knowledge that there was such a place as Durazzo, who was responsible for bringing this comfortable official out of his bed in the early hours of the morning, causing him, albeit reluctantly, and with violent and insubordinate language, to conduct certain investigations in the crowded bazaars. At first he was unsuccessful, because there were many Hussein Effendis in Durazzo. He sent an invitation to the American consul to come to Tiffin and help him. Why the dickens the Foreign Office should suddenly be interested in Hussein Effendi, I cannot for the life of me understand. The Foreign Department has to be interested in something, you know, said the genial American. I receive some of the quaintest requests from Washington. I rather fancy they only wire you to find out if they are there. Why are you doing this? I've seen Hawkett Bay, said the English official. I wonder what this fellow has been doing. There's probably a wigging for me in the offing. At about the same time, the sewerman in the bosom of his own family was taking loud and noisy sips from a big mug of tea. Don't you be surprised, he said to his admiring better half, if I have to go up to the Old Bailey to give evidence. Lord, Joe, she said with interest, what has happened? The sewerman filled his pipe and told the story with a wealth of rambling detail. He gave particulars of the hour he had descended the Victoria Street shaft, of what Bill Morgan had said to him as they were going down, of what he had said to Harry Carter as they splashed along the low-roofed tunnel, of how he had a funny feeling that he was going to make a discovery, and so on and so forth, until he reached his long-delayed climax. DX waited up very late that night, and at 12 o'clock his patience was rewarded, for the Foreign Office messenger brought a telegram to him. It was addressed to the chief secretary and ran, Number 847, yours, 63952 of yesterday's date. Begins. Hussein Effendi, a prosperous merchant of this city, left for Italy to place his daughter in convent, Marie Theresa, Florence. Hussein being Christian. He goes on to Paris. Apply Raleigh Theocritus et CIE, Rue de l'Opera, Inns. Half an hour later, TX had a telephone connection through to Paris and was instructing the British police agent in that city. He received a further telephone report from Paris the next morning, and one which gave him infinite satisfaction. Very slowly, but surely, he was gathering together the pieces of this baffling mystery and was fitting them together. Hussein Effendi would probably supply the last missing segments. At 8 o'clock that night, the door opened, and the man who represented TX in Paris came in carrying a traveling ulster on his arm. TX gave him a nod, and then, as the newcomer stood with the door open, obviously waiting for somebody to follow him, he said, "Show him in. I will see him alone." There walked into his office a tall man wearing a frock coat and a red fez. He was a man from 55 to 60, powerfully built, with a grave, dark face and a thin fringe of white beard. He salaamed as he entered. "You speak French, I believe," said TX presently. The other bowed. "My agent has explained to you," said TX in French, "that I desire some information for the purpose of clearing up a crime which has been committed in this country. I have given you my assurance that if assurance was necessary, that you would come to no harm as a result of anything you might tell me." "That I understand, Effendi," said the tall Turk. "The Americans and the English have always been good friends of mine, and I have been frequently in London. Therefore, I shall be very pleased to be of any help to you." TX walked to a closed bookcase on one side of the room, unlocked it, took out an object wrapped in white tissue paper. He laid this on the table, the Turk watching the proceedings with an impassive face. Very slowly, the commissioner unrolled the little bundle and revealed at long last a slim knife, rusted and stained, with a hilt which in its untarnished days had evidently been of chased silver. He lifted the dagger from the table and handed it to the Turk. "This is yours, I believe," he said softly. The man turned it over, stepping nearer the table, that he might secure the advantage of a better light. He examined the blade near the hilt and handed the weapon back to TX. "That is my knife," he said. TX smiled. You understand, of course, that I saw Hussein Effendi of Durazo inscribed in Arabic near the hilt." The Turk inclined his head. "With this weapon," TX went on, speaking with slow emphasis, "a murder was committed in this town." There was no sign of interest or astonishment, or indeed of any emotion whatever. "It is the will of God," he said calmly. "These things happen even in a great city like London." "It was your knife," suggested TX. "But my hand was in Durazo, Effendi," said the Turk. He looked at the knife again. "So, the Black Roman is dead, Effendi." "The Black Roman?" asked TX, a little puzzled. "The Greek they call Kara," said the Turk. "He was a very wicked man." TX was up on his feet now, leaning across the table and looking at the other with narrowed eyes. "How did you know it was Kara?" he asked quickly. The Turk shrugged his shoulders. "Who else could it be?" he said. "Are not your newspapers filled with the story?" TX sat back again, disappointed and a little annoyed with himself. "That is true, Hussein Effendi, but I did not think you read the papers." "Neither do I, master," replied the other coolly. "Nor did I know that Kara had been killed until I saw this knife. How came this into your possession?" "It was found in a rain sewer," said TX, "into which the murderer had apparently dropped it. But if you have not read the newspapers, Effendi, then you admit that you know who committed this murder." The Turk raised his hand slowly to a level with his shoulders. "Though I am a Christian," he said, "there are many wise sayings of my father's religion which I remember. And one of these, Effendi, was the wicked must die in the habitations of the just. By the weapons of the worthy shall the wicked perish. Your Excellency, I am a worthy man, for never have I done a dishonest thing in my life. I have traded fairly with Greeks, with Italians, have with Frenchmen and with Englishmen, also with Jews. I have never sought to rob them nor to hurt them. If I have killed men, God knows it was not because I desired their death, but because their lives were dangerous to me and to mine. Ask the blade all your questions, and see what answer it gives. Until it speaks, I am as dumb as the blade, for it is also written that the soldier is the servant of his sword, and also the wise servant is dumb about his master's affairs. TX laughed helplessly. I had hoped that you might be able to help me. Hoped and feared, he said. If you cannot speak, it is not my business to force you, either by threat or by act. I am grateful to you for having come over, although the visit has been rather fruitless so far as I am concerned. He smiled again and offered his hand. Excellency, said the old Turk soberly, there are some things in life that are well left alone, and there are moments when justice should be so blind that she does not see guilt. Here is such a moment. And this ended the interview, one on which TX had set very high hopes. His gloom carried to Portman Place, where he had arranged to meet Belinda Mary. Where is Mr. Lexman going to give this famous lecture of his? Was the question with which he greeted him. And please, what is the subject? It is on a subject which is of supreme interest to me, he said gravely. He has called his lecture The Clue of the Twisted Candle. There is no clearer brain being employed in the business of criminal detection than John Lexman's. Though he uses his genius for the construction of stories, were it employed in the legitimate business of police work, I am certain he would make a mark second to none in the world. He is determined on giving this lecture, and he has issued a number of invitations. These include the chiefs of the secret police of nearly all the civilized countries of the world. O'Grady is on his way from America. He wirelessed me this morning to that effect. Even the chief of the Russian police has accepted the invitation, because, as you know, this murder has excited a great deal of interest in police circles everywhere. John Lexman is not only going to deliver this lecture, he said slowly, but he is going to tell us who committed the murder and how it was committed. She thought a moment. Where will it be delivered? I don't know, he said in astonishment. Does that matter? It matters a great deal, she said emphatically, especially if I want it delivered in a certain place. Would you induce Mr. Lexman to lecture at my house? At Portman Place, he asked. She shook her head. No, I have a house of my own, a furnished house I have rented at Blackheath. Will you induce Mr. Lexman to give the lecture there? But why? He asked. Please don't ask any questions, she pleaded. Do this for me, Tommy. He saw she was in earnest. I'll write to old Lexman this afternoon, he promised. John Lexman telephoned his reply. I should prefer somewhere out of London, he said, and since Miss Bartholomew has some interest in the matter, may I extend my invitation to her? I promise she shall not be any more shocked than a good woman need be. And so it came about that the name of Belinda Mary Bartholomew was added to the selected list of police chiefs who were making for London at that moment to hear from the man who had guaranteed the solution of the story of Kara and his killing, the unravelment of the mystery which surrounded his death, and the significance of the twisted candles which at that moment were reposing in the Black Museum at Scotland Yard. So, before things get revealed, who do you think it was? Everybody make a guess. Some kind of guess. Was it Fisher? Was it Belinda Mary? Was it John Lexman? John Lexman's wife? TX? Mr. Gathercole? A fake Mr. Gathercole because the real one's actually dead? What do we think? The Turk, perhaps? Anybody have a guess? Anybody? You're going to accuse the candles themselves? Okay. It would be fairly difficult for a candle to do a stabbing, but sure. I think it was Gathercole. I think that he faked the conversation as he was leaving. And although they talked about magnets and how the magnet couldn't lift the bar, they didn't say that a magnet couldn't put the bar in place. So I think it's possible that maybe whoever was there as gather coal closed the door and put the bar in place with a magnet attached to his fake arm. There's a Pokemon who will steal your soul if you sleep next to it. Don't play with that Pokemon. This is bad news bears. All right. Well, chapter 20. The room was a big one, and most of the furniture had been cleared out to admit the guests who had come from the ends of the earth to learn the story of the twisted candles, and to test John Lexman's theory by their own. It's not adorable if it steals your soul. That means it's a deadite. Swallow your soul, swallow your soul. It's no good. Don't hang out with deadites. The adorableness is just a trap. They sat around chatting cheerfully of men and crimes, of great coups planned and frustrated, of strange deeds committed and undetected. Scraps of their conversation came to Belinda Mary as she stood in the chintz-draped doorway which led from the drawing room to the room she used as a study. "Do you remember, Sir George, the Bulbrook case? I took the man at Odessa. The curious thing was that I found no money on the body, only a small gold charm set with a single emerald. So I knew it was the girl with the fur bonnet who had. Pino got away after putting 3 bullets into me, but I dragged myself to the window and shot him dead. It was a real good shot." They rose to meet her, and TX introduced her to the men. It was at that moment that John Lexman was announced. He looked tired, but returned the commissioner's greeting with a cheerful mien. He knew all the men present by name, as they knew him. He had a few sheets of notes, which he laid on the little table which had been placed for him, and when the introductions were finished, he went to this, and with scarcely any preliminary, began. I mean, I feel like the warmth is just to make you, think you're comfortable and sit down to sleep so they can steal your soul. Again, it's a trap. Chapter 21. The Narrative of John Lexman. I am, as you may all know, a writer of stories which depend for their success upon the creation and unravelment of criminological mysteries. The Chief Commissioner has been good enough to tell you that my stories were something more than a mere seeking after sensation, and that I endeavored, in the course of those narratives, to propound obscure but possible situations, and with the ingenuity that I could command, to offer to those problems a solution acceptable, not only to the general reader, but to the police expert. Although I did not regard my earlier work with any great seriousness, and indeed only sought after exciting situations and incidents, I can see now, looking back, that underneath the work which seemed at the time purposeless, there was something very much like a scheme of studies. You must forgive this egotism in me because it is necessary that I should make this explanation, and you, who are in the main police officers of considerable experience and discernment, should appreciate the fact that, as I was able to get inside the minds of the fictitious criminals I portrayed, so am I now able to follow the mind of the man who committed this murder, or if not to follow his mind, to recreate the psychology of the slayer of Remington Kara. In the possession of most of you are the vital facts concerning this man. You know the type of man he was. You have instances of his terrible ruthlessness. You know that he was a blot upon God's earth, a vicious, wicked ego, seeking the gratification of that strange bloodlust and painlust which is to be found in so few criminals. John Lexman went on to describe the killing of Vassalaro. "I know now how that occurred," he said. "I had received on the previous Christmas Eve, amongst other presents, a pistol from an unknown admirer. That unknown admirer was Kara, who had planned this murder some 3 months ahead. He it was who sent me the Browning, knowing as he did that I had never used such a weapon, and that therefore I would be chary about using it. I might have put the pistol away in a cupboard out of reach, and the whole of his carefully thought-out plan would have miscarried. But Kara was systematic in all things. 3 weeks after I received the weapon, a clumsy attempt was made to break into my house in the middle of the night. It struck me at the time it was clumsy, because the burglar made a tremendous amount of noise, and disappeared soon after he began his attempt, doing no more damage than to break a window in my dining room. Naturally, my mind went to the possibility of a further attempt of this kind, as my house stood on the outskirts of the village, and it was only natural that I should take the pistol from one of my boxes and put it somewhere handy. To make doubly sure, Kara came down the next day and heard the full story of the outrage. He did not speak of pistols, but I remember now, though I did not remember at the time, that I mentioned the fact that I had a handy weapon. A fortnight later, a second attempt was made to enter the house. I say an attempt, but again I do not believe that the intention was at all serious. The outrage was designed to keep that pistol of mine in a get-at-able place. And again, Kara came down to see us on the day following the burglary, and again I must have told him, though I have no distinct recollection of the fact, of what had happened the previous night. It would have been unnatural if I had not mentioned the fact, as it was a matter which had formed a subject of discussion between myself, my wife, and the servants. Then came the threatening letter, with Kara providentially at hand. On the night of the murder, whilst Kara was still in my house, I went out to find his chauffeur. Kara remained a few minutes with my wife, and then on some excuse went into the library. There he loaded the pistol, placing one cartridge in the chamber, and trusting to luck that I did not pull the trigger until I had it pointed at my victim. Here he took his biggest chance, because, before sending the weapon to me, he had the spring of the Browning so eased that the slightest touch set it off, and as you know, the pistol being automatic, the explosion of one cartridge, reloading and firing the next, and so on, it was probably that a chance touch would have brought his scheme to naught. Probably me also. Of what happened on that night you are aware. He went on to tell of his trial and conviction, and skimmed over the life he led until that morning on Dartmoor. Kara knew my innocence had been proved, and his hatred for me being his great obsession, since I had the thing he had wanted, but no longer wanted. Let that be understood. He saw the misery he had planned for me and my dear wife being brought to a sudden end. He had, by the way, already planned and carried his plan into execution, a system of tormenting her. You did not know, he turned to TX, that scarcely a month passed, but some disreputable villain called at her flat, with a story that he had been released from Portland or Wormwood Scrubs that morning, and that he had seen me. The story each messenger brought was one sufficient to break the heart of any but the bravest woman. It was a story of ill treatment by brutal officials, of my illness, of my madness, of everything calculated to harrow the feelings of a tender-hearted and faithful wife. That was Kara's scheme, not to hurt with the whip or with the knife, but to cut deep at the heart with his evil tongue, to cut to the raw places of the mind. When he found that I was to be released, he may have guessed, or he may have discovered by some underhand method, that a pardon was about to be signed. He conceived his great plan. He had less than 2 days to execute it. Through one of his agents, he found a warder who had been in some trouble with the authorities, a man who was avaricious and was even then on the brink of being discharged from the service for trafficking with prisoners. The bribe he offered this man was a heavy one, and the warder accepted. Kara had purchased a new monoplane, and as you know, he was an excellent aviator. With this new machine, he flew to Devon and arrived at dawn in one of the unfrequented parts of the moor. The story of my own escape needs no telling. My narrative really begins from the moment I put my foot upon the deck of the Imprint. The first person I asked to see, that was the ship that they boarded. The first person I asked to see was, naturally, my wife. Kara, however, insisted on my going to the cabin he had prepared and changing my clothes, and until then I did not realize I was still in my convict's garb. A clean change was waiting for me, and the luxury of soft shirts and well-fitting garments after the prison uniform I cannot describe. After I was dressed, I was taken by the Greek steward to the larger stateroom, and there I found my darling waiting for me. His voice sank almost to a whisper, and it was a minute or two before he had mastered his emotions. She had been suspicious of Kara, but he had been very insistent. He had detailed the plans and shown her the monoplane, but even then she would not trust herself on board, and she had been waiting in a motorboat, moving parallel with the yacht, until she saw the landing and realized, as she thought, that Kara was not playing her false. The motorboat had been hired by Kara, and the 2 men inside were probably as well bribed as the warder. The joy of freedom can only be known to those who have suffered the horrors of restraint. That is a trite enough statement, but when one is describing elemental things, there is no room for subtlety. The voyage was a fairly eventless one. We saw very little of Kara, who did not intrude himself upon us, and our main excitement lay in the apprehension that we should be held up by a British destroyer, or that when we reached Gibraltar, we should be searched by the Brits' authorities. Kara had foreseen that possibility, and had taken enough coal to last him for the run. We had a fairly stormy passage in the Mediterranean, but after that, nothing happened until we arrived at Durazzo. We had to go ashore in disguise, because Kara told us that the English consul might see us and make some trouble. We wore Turkish dresses, Grace heavily veiled and I wearing a greasy old kaftan, which with my somewhat emaciated face and my unshaven appearance passed me without comment. Kara's home was, and is, about 18 miles from Durazzo. It is not on the main road, but it is reached by following one of the rocky mountain paths which wind and twist among the hills to the southeast of the town. The country is wild and mainly uncultivated. We had to pass through swamps and skirt huge lagoons as we mounted higher and higher, from terrace to terrace, and came to the roads which cross the mountains. Kara's palace, you could call it no less, is really built within sight of the sea. It is on the Acroceraunian Peninsula, near Cape Linguetta. Hereabouts, the country is more populated and better cultivated. We passed great slopes entirely covered with mulberry and olive trees, whilst in the valleys there were fields of maize and corn. The palazzo stands on a lofty plateau. It is approached by 2 paths, which can be, and have been, well defended in the past, against the Sultan's troops, or against the bands which have been raised by rival villages with the object of storming and plundering this stronghold. The Skipetars, a bloodthirsty crowd without pity or remorse, were faithful enough to their chief as Kara was. He paid them so well that it was not profitable to rob him. Moreover, he kept their own turbulent elements fully occupied with the little raids with which he or his agents organized from time to time. The palazzo was built rather in the Moorish than in the Turkish style. It was a sort of Eastern type to which was grafted an Italian architecture, a house of white-columned courts, of big paved yards, fountains, and cool, dark rooms. When I passed through the gates, I realized for the first time something of Kara's importance. There were a score of servants, all Eastern, perfectly trained, silent and obsequious. He led us to his own room. It was a big apartment with divans running round the wall, the most ornate French drawing-room suite, and an enormous Persian carpet, one of the finest of the kind that has ever been turned out of Shiraz. Here, let me say, that throughout the trip, his attitude to me had been perfectly friendly, and toward Grace all that I could ask of my best friend, considerate and tactful. We had hardly reached his room before he said to me with that bonhomie which he had observed throughout the trip, "You would like to see your room?" I expressed a wish to that effect. He clapped his hands, and a big Albanian servant came through the curtained doorway, made the usual salam, and Kara spoke to him a few words in a language which I presume was Turkish. "He will show you the way," said Kara, with his most genial smile. I followed the servant through the curtains, which had hardly fallen behind me, before I was seized by 4 men, flung violently on the ground. A filthy tarbage was thrust into my mouth, and before I knew what was happening, I was bound hand and foot. As I realized the gross treachery of the man, my first frantic thoughts were of Grace and her safety. I struggled with the strength of 3 men, but they were too many for me, and I was dragged along the passage. A door was opened, and I was flung into a bare room. I must have been lying on the floor for half an hour when they came for me, this time accompanied by a middle-aged man named Savolio, who was either an Italian or a Greek. He spoke English fairly well, and he made it clear to me that I had to behave myself. I was led back to the room from whence I had come, and found Kara sitting in one of those big armchairs which he affected, smoking a cigarette. Confronting him, still in her Turkish dress, was poor Grace. She was not bound, I was pleased to see, But when on my entrance, she rose and made as if to come toward me. She was unceremoniously thrown back by the guardian who stood at her side. "Mr. John Lexman," drawled Kara, "you are at the beginning of a great disillusionment. I have a few things to tell you which will make you feel rather uncomfortable." It was then that I heard for the first time that my pardon had been signed and my innocence discovered. "Having taken a great deal of trouble to get you in prison," said Kara, "it isn't likely that I'm going to allow all my plans to be undone, and my plan is to make you both extremely uncomfortable." He did not raise his voice, speaking still in the same conversational tone, suave and half amused. "I hate you for 2 things," he said, and ticked them off on his fingers. "The first is that you took the woman that I wanted. To a man of my temperament, that is an unpardonable crime. I have never wanted women either as friends or as amusement. I am one of the few people in the world who are self-sufficient. It happened that I wanted your wife, and she rejected me, because apparently she preferred you." He looked at me quizzically. "You are thinking at this moment," he went on slowly, "that I want her now, and that is part of my revenge, that I shall put her straight in my harem. Nothing is farther from my desires or my thoughts. The Black Roman is not satisfied with the leavings of such poor trash as you. I hate you both equally, and for both of you there is waiting an experience more terrible than even your elastic imagination can conjure. You understand what that means?" He asked me, still retaining his calm. I did not reply. I dared not look at Grace, to whom he turned. "I believe you love your husband, my friend," he said. "Your love will be put to a very severe test. You shall see him the mere wreckage of the man he is. You shall see him brutalized below the level of the cattle in the field. I will give you both no joys, no ease of mind. From this moment you are slaves, and worse than slaves." He clapped his hands. The interview was ended, and from that moment I only saw Grace once. John Lexman stopped and buried his face in his hands. They took me to an underground dungeon cut in the solid rock. In many ways it resembled the dungeon of the Chateau of Chalon, and in that its only window looked out upon a wild, storm-swept lake, and its floor was jagged rock. I have called it underground, as indeed it was on that side, for the palazzo was built upon a steep slope running down from the spur of the hills. They chained me by the legs and left me to my own devices. Once a day they gave me a little goat flesh and a pannikin of water, and once a week Kara would come in, and outside the radius of my chain he would open a little camp stool, and sitting down, smoke his cigarette and talk. My God, the things that man said, the things he described, the horrors he related. And always it was Grace who was the center of this description. And he would relate the stories he was telling to her about myself. I cannot describe them. They are beyond repetition. John Lexman shuddered and closed his eyes. That was his weapon. He did not confront me with the torture of my darling. He did not bring tangible evidence of her suffering. He just sat and talked, describing with a remarkable clarity of language which seemed incredible in a foreigner, the amusements which he himself had witnessed. I thought I should go mad. Twice I sprang at him, and twice the chain about my legs threw me headlong on that cruel floor. Once he brought the jailer in to whip me, but I took the whipping with such phlegm that it gave him no satisfaction. I tell you I had seen Grace only once, and this is how it happened. It was after the flogging, and Kara, who was a veritable demon in his rage, planned to have his revenge for my indifference. They brought Grace out upon a boat, and rowed the boat to where I could see it from my window. There, the whip which had been applied to me was applied to her. I can't tell you any more about that, he said brokenly. But I wish you don't know how fervently that I had broken down and given the dog the satisfaction he wanted. My God, it was horrible. When the winter came, they used to take me out with chains on my legs to gather wood from the forest. There was no reason why I should be given this work, but the truth was, as I discovered from Savolio, that Kara thought my dungeon was too warm. It was sheltered from the winds by the hill behind, and even on the coldest days and nights it was not unbearable. Then Kara went away for some time. I think he must have gone to England, and he came back in a white fury. One of his big plans had gone wrong, and the mental torture he inflicted upon me was more acute than ever. In the old days, he used to come once a week. Now, he came almost every day. He usually arrived in the afternoon, and I was surprised one night to be awakened from my sleep to see him standing at the door, a lantern in his hand, his inevitable cigarette in his mouth. He always wore the Albanian costume when he was in the country, those white kilted skirts and zouave jackets which the hillsmen affect, and if anything, had added to his demoniacal appearance. He put down the lantern and leant against the wall. "I'm afraid that wife of yours is breaking up, Lexman," he drawled. "She isn't the good, stout English stuff that I thought she was." I made no reply. I had found by bitter experience that if I intruded into the conversation, I should only suffer the more. "I have sent down to Durazzo to get a doctor," he went on. "Naturally, having taken all this trouble, I don't want to lose you by death. She is breaking up," he repeated with relish, and yet with an undertone of annoyance in his voice. "She asked for you 3 times this morning." I kept myself under control, as I had never expected that a man so desperately circumstanced could do. "Kara," I said as quietly as I could, "what has she done that she should deserve this hell in which she has lived?" He sent out a long ring of smoke and watched its progress across the dungeon. "What has she done?" he said, keeping his eye on the ring. I shall always remember every look, every gesture, every intonation of his voice. "Why, she has done all that a woman can do for a man like me. She has made me feel little. Until I had a rebuff from her, I had all the world at my feet, Lexman. I did as I liked. If I crooked my little finger, people ran after me, and that one experience with her has broken me. Oh, don't think," he went on quickly, "that I am broken in love. I never loved her very much. It was just a passing passion. But she killed my self-confidence. After then, whenever I came to a crucial moment in my affairs, when the big manner, the big certainty was absolutely necessary for me to carry my way, whenever I was most confident of myself and my ability and my scheme, a vision of this damned girl rose, and I felt that momentary weakening, that memory of defeat which made all the difference between success and failure. I hated her, and I hate her still," he said with vehemence. "If she dies, I shall hate her more, because she will remain everlastingly unbroken to menace my thoughts and spoil my schemes through all eternity." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his clenched fist under his chin. How well I can see him, and stared at me. "I could have been king here in this land," he said, waving his hand toward the interior. "I could have bribed and shot my way to the throne of Albania. Don't you realize what that means to a man like me? There is still a chance, and if I could keep your wife alive, if I could see her broken in reason and in health, a poor skeleton, gibbering thing that knelt at my feet when I came near her, I should recover the mastery of myself." "Believe me," he said, nodding his head, "your wife will have the best medical advice that it is possible to obtain." Kara went out, and I did not see him again for a very long time. He sent word, just a scrawled note in the morning, to say my wife had died. John Lexman rose up from his seat and paced the apartment, his head upon his breast. "From that moment," he said, "I lived only for one thing, to punish Remington Kara. And gentlemen, I punished him." He stood in the center of the room and thumped his broad chest with his clenched hand. "I killed Remington Kara," he said, and there was a little gasp of astonishment from every man present save one. That one was T.X. Meredith, who had known all the time. Chapter 22. After a while, Lexman resumed his story. "I told you that there was a man at the palazzo named Salvolio. Salvolio was a man who had been undergoing a life sentence in one of the prisons of southern Italy. In some mysterious fashion he escaped and got across the Adriatic in a small boat. How Kara found him I don't know. Salvolio was a very uncommunicative person. I was never certain whether he was a Greek or an Italian. All that I am sure about is that he was the most unmitigated villain next to his master that I have ever met. He was a quick man with his knife, and I have seen him kill one of the guards, whom he had thought was favoring me in the matter of diet, with less compunction than you would kill a rat. It was he who gave me this scar. John Lexman pointed to his cheek. In his master's absence, he took upon himself the task of conducting a clumsy imitation of Kara's persecution. He gave me, too, the only glimpse I ever had of the torture poor Grace underwent. She hated dogs, and Kara must have come to know this, and in her sleeping room she was apparently better accommodated than I. He kept 4 fierce beasts, so chained that they could almost reach her. Some reference to my wife from this low brute maddened me beyond endurance, and I sprang at him. He whipped out his knife and struck at me as I fell, and I escaped by a miracle. He evidently had orders not to touch me, for he was in a great panic of mind, as he had reason to be, because on Kara's return he discovered the state of my face, started an inquiry, and had Salvolio taken to the courtyard in the true Eastern style, and bastinadoed until his feet were pulp. I'm guessing that means whipped his feet. You may be sure the man hated me with a malignity which almost rivaled his employer's. After Grace's death, Kara went away suddenly, and I was left to the tender mercy of this man. Evidently, he had been given a fairly free hand. The principal object of Kara's hate being dead, he took little further interest in me, or else wearied of his hobby. Salvolio began his persecutions by reducing my diet. Fortunately, I ate very little. Nevertheless, the supplies began to grow less and less, and I was beginning to feel the effects of this starvation system, when there happened a thing which changed the whole course of my life, and opened to me a way to freedom and to vengeance. So, anybody pick that up about the dog chained near her bed? Remember, Belinda Mary heard a sigh, not a bark, not a growl, but a sigh in that little room, and then she killed a dog that was chained up down there. And Lexman didn't see a body. Well, hello, Alex. That's a very interesting object to have next to your bed. Maybe on a more mature stream we'll have to talk about that. I think that the one that Belinda Mary has been keeping in that house is actually Grace, and that she's really alive, and that she was being kept as a prisoner under the house in London. Salvolio did not imitate the austerity of his master, and in Kara's absence was in the habit of having little orgies of his own. He would bring up dancing girls from Durazzo for his amusement, and invite prominent men in the neighborhood to his feasts and entertainments, for he was absolutely lord of the palazzo when Kara was away, and could do pretty well as he liked. On this particular night, the festivities had been more than usually prolonged, for as near as I could judge by the daylight which was creeping in through my window, it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, when the big, steel-sheeted door was opened, and Salvolio came in, more than a little drunk. He brought with him, as I judged, one of his dancing girls, who apparently was privileged to see the sights of the palace. For a long time he stood in the doorway, talking incoherently in a language which I think must have been Turkish, for I caught 1 or 2 words. Whoever the girl was, she seemed a little frightened. I could see that, because she shrank back from him, though his arm was about her shoulders, and he was half supporting his weight upon her. There was fear, not only in the curious little glances she shot at me from time to time, but also in the averted face. Her story I was about to learn. She was not of the class from whence Salvolio found the dancers, who from time to time came up to the palace for his amusements, but in the amusement of his guests. She was the daughter of a Turkish merchant of Scutari, who had been received into the Catholic Church. Her father had gone down to Durazzo during the First Balkan War, and then Salvolio had seen the girl unknown to her parent, and there had been some rough kind of courtship, which ended in her running away on this very day, and joining her ill-favored lover at the palazzo. I tell you this because the fact had some bearing on my own fate. As I say, the girl was frightened, and made as though to go from the dungeon. She was probably scared both by the unkempt prisoner and by the drunken man at her side. He, however, could not leave without showing to her something of his authority. He came lurching over near where I lay, his long knife balanced in his hand, ready for emergencies, and broke into a string of vituperations of the character to which I was quite hardened. Then he took a flying kick at me, and got a home in my ribs. But again I experienced neither a sense of indignity nor any great hurt. Salvolio had treated me like this before, and I had survived it. In the midst of this tirade, looking past him, I was a new witness to an extraordinary scene. The girl stood in the open doorway, shrinking back against the door, looking with distress and pity at the spectacle which Salvolio's brutality afforded. Then suddenly there appeared beside her a tall Turk. He was grey-bearded and forbidding. She looked round and saw him, and her mouth opened to utter a cry, but with a gesture he silenced her, and pointed to the darkness outside. Without a word she cringed past him, her sandaled feet making no noise. All this time Salvolio was continuing his stream of abuse, but he must have seen the wonder in my eyes, for he stopped and turned. The old Turk took one stride forward, and circled his body with his left arm, and there they stood grotesquely like a couple who were going to start to waltz. The Turk was a head taller than Salvolio, and as I could see, a man of immense strength. They looked at one another, face to face, Salvolio rapidly recovering his senses, and then the Turk gave him a gentle punch in the ribs. That is what it seemed like to me, but Salvolio coughed horribly, went limp in the other's arms, and dropped with a thud to the ground. The Turk leant down soberly and wiped his long knife on the other's jacket before he put it back in the sash at his waist. Then, with a glance at me, he turned to go, but stopped at the door and looked back thoughtfully. He said something in Turkish which I could not understand. Then he spoke in French. "Who are you?" he asked. In as few words as possible, I explained. He came over and looked at the manacle about my leg and shook his head. "You will never be able to get that undone," he said. He caught hold of the chain, which was a fairly long one, bound it twice round his arm, and steadying his arm across his thigh, he turned with a sudden jerk. There was a smart snap as the chain parted. He caught me by the shoulder and pulled me to his feet. "Put the chain about your waist, Effendi," he said, and he took a revolver from his belt and handed it to me. "You may need this before we get back to Durazzo," he said. His belt was literally bristling with weapons. I saw 3 revolvers beside the one I possessed, and he had, evidently, come prepared for trouble. Clearly he came to get his daughter back. We made our way from the dungeon into the clean-smelling world without. It was the second time I had been in the open air for 18 months, and my knees were trembling under me with weakness and excitement. The old man shut the prison door behind us and walked on until we came up to the girl waiting for us by the lakeside. She was weeping softly, and he spoke to her a few words in a low voice, and her weeping ceased. "This daughter of mine will show us the way," he said. "I do not know this part of the country. She knows it too well." To cut a long story short, said Lexman, we reached Durazzo in the afternoon. There was no attempt made to follow us up, and neither my absence nor the body of Salvolio were discovered until late in the afternoon. You must remember that nobody but Salvolio was allowed into my prison, and therefore nobody had the courage to make any investigations. The old man got me to his house without being observed, and brought a brother-in-law or some relative of his to remove the anklet. The name of my host was Hussein Effendi. That same night we left with the little caravan to visit some of the old man's relatives. He was not certain what would be the consequence of his act, and for safety's sake took this trip, which would enable him, if need be, to seek sanctuary with some of the wilder Turkish tribes, who would give him protection. In that 3 months I saw Albania as it is. It was an experience never to be forgotten. If there is a better man in God's world than Hiabam Hussein Effendi, I have yet to meet him. It was he who provided me with money to leave Albania. I begged from him, too, the knife with which he had killed Salvolio. He had discovered that Kara was in England, and told me something of the Greeks' occupation which I had not known before. I crossed to Italy and went on to Milan. There it was that I learnt that an eccentric Englishman who had arrived a few days previously on one of the South American boats at Genoa was in my hotel, desperately ill. My hotel, I need hardly tell you, was not a very expensive one, and we were evidently the only 2 Englishmen in the place. I could do no less than go up and see what I could do for the poor fellow, who was pretty well gone when I saw him. I seemed to remember having seen him before, and when looking round for some identification, I discovered his name. I readily recalled the circumstance. It was George Gathercole, who had returned from South America. He was suffering from malarial fever and blood poisoning, and for a week with an Italian doctor, I fought as hard as any man could fight for his life. He was a trying patient. John Lexman smiled suddenly at the recollection. Vitriolic in his language, impatient and imperious in his attitude to his friends. He was, for example, terribly sensitive about his lost arm, and would not allow either the doctor or myself to enter the room until he was covered to the neck, nor would he eat or drink in our presence. Yet he was the bravest of the brave, careless of himself, and only fretful because he had not time to finish his new book. His indomitable spirit did not save him. He died on the 17th of January of this year. I was in Genoa at the time, having gone there at his request to save his belongings. When I returned, he had been buried. I went through his papers, and it was then that I conceived my idea of how I might approach Kara. I found a letter from the Greek, which had been addressed to Buenos Aires, to await arrival, and then I remembered in a flash how Kara had told me he had sent George Gathercole to South America to report upon possible gold formations. I was determined to kill Kara, and determined to kill him in such a way that I myself would cover every trace of my complicity. Even as he had planned my downfall, scheming every step and covering his trail, so did I plan to bring about his death, that no suspicion should fall on me. I knew his house. I knew something of his habits. I knew the fear which he went when he was in England and away from the feudal guards who had surrounded him in Albania. I knew of his famous door with its steel latch, and I was planning to circumvent all these precautions and bring to him not only the death he deserved, but a full knowledge of his fate before he died. Gathercole had some money, about 140 pounds. I took 100 pounds of this for my own use, knowing that I should have sufficient in London to recompense his heirs, and the remainder of the money with all such documents as he had, save those which identified him with Kara, I handed over to the British consul. I was not unlike the dead man. My beard had grown wild, and I knew enough of Gathercole's eccentricities to live the part. The first step I took was to announce my arrival by inference. I'm a fairly good journalist, with a wide general knowledge, and with this, corrected by reference to the necessary books which I found in the British Museum Library, I was able to turn out a very respectable article on Patagonia. This I sent to the Times with one of Gathercole's cards, and, as you know, it was printed. My next step was to find suitable lodgings between Chelsea and Scotland Yard. I was fortunate in being able to hire a furnished flat, the owner of which was going to the south of France for 3 months. I paid the rent in advance, and since I dropped all the eccentricities I had assumed to support the character of Gathercole, I must have impressed the owner, who took me without references. I had several suits of new clothes made, not in London, he smiled, but in Manchester, and again I made myself as trim as possible to avoid after-identification. When I had got these together in my flat, I chose my day. In the morning, I sent 2 trunks with most of my personal belongings to the Great Midland Hotel. In the afternoon, I went to Cadogan Square and hung about until I saw Kara drive off. It was my first view of him since I had left Albania, and it required all my self-control to prevent me springing at him in the street and tearing at him with my hands. Once he was out of sight, I went to the house, adopting all the style and all the mannerisms of poor Gathercole. My beginning was unfortunate, for, with a shock, I recognized in the valet a fellow convict who had been with me in the warder's cottage on the morning of my escape from Dartmoor. There was no mistaking him, and when I heard his voice, I was certain. Would he recognize me, I wondered, in spite of my beard and my eyeglasses? Apparently he did not. I gave him every chance. I thrust my face into his, and on my second visit, challenged him in the eccentric way which poor old Gathercole had, to test the gray of my beard. For the moment, however, I was satisfied with my brief experiment, and after a reasonable interval I went away, returning to my place off Victoria Street and waiting till the evening. In my observation of the house, whilst I was waiting for Kara to depart, I had noticed that there were 2 distinct telephone wires running down to the roof. I guessed, rather than knew, that one of these telephones was a private wire, and knowing something of Kara's fear, I presumed that that wire would lead to a police office, or at any rate to a guardian of some kind or other. Kara had the same arrangement in Albania, connecting the palazzo with the gendarme post at Alesso. This much Hussein told me. That night, I made a reconnaissance of the house, and saw Kara's window was lit, and at 10 minutes past 10, I rang the bell, and I think it was then that I applied the test of the beard. Kara was in his room. The valet told me and led the way upstairs. I had come prepared to deal with this valet, for I had an especial reason for wishing that he should not be interrogated by the police. On a plain card I had written the number he bore in Dartmoor, and had added the words, "I know you. Get out of here, quick." As he turned to lead the way upstairs, I flung the envelope containing the card on the table in the hall. In an inside pocket, as near to my body as I could put them, I had the 2 candles. How I should use them both I had already decided. The valet ushered me into Kara's room, and once more I stood in the presence of the man who had killed my girl and blotted out all that was beautiful in life for me. There was a breathless silence when he paused. TX leaned back in his chair, his head upon his breast, his arms folded, his eyes watching the other intently. The chief commissioner, with a heavy frown and pursed lips, sat stroking his mustache and looking under his shaggy eyebrows at the speaker. The French police officer, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his head on one side, was taking in every word eagerly. The sallow-faced Russian, impassive of face, might have been a carved ivory mask. O'Grady, the American, the stump of a dead cigar between his teeth, shifted impatiently with every pause, as though he would hurry forward the denouement. Presently John Lexman went on. He slipped from the bed and came across to meet me as I closed the door behind me. "Ah, Mr. Gathercole," he said, in that silky tone of his, and held out his hand. I did not speak. I just looked at him with a sort of fierce joy in my heart, the like of which I had never before experienced. And then he saw in my eyes the truth, and half reached for the telephone. But at that moment I was on him. He was a child in my hands. All the bitter anguish he had brought upon me, all the hardships of starved days and freezing nights, had strengthened and hardened me. I had come back to London disguised with a false arm, and this I shook free. It was merely a gauntlet of thin wood which I had made for me in Paris. I flung him back on the bed, and half knelt, half laid on him. "Kara," I said, "you are going to die, a more merciful death than my wife died." He tried to speak. His soft hands gesticulated wildly, but I was half lying on one arm and held the other. I whispered in his ear, "Nobody will know who killed you, Kara. Think of that. I shall go scot-free, and you will be the center of a fine mystery. All your letters will be read, all your life will be examined, and the world will know you for what you are." I released his arm for just as long as it took to draw my knife and strike. I think he died instantly, John Lexman said simply. I left him where he was and went to the door. I had not much time to spare. I took the candles from my pocket. They were already ductile from the heat of my body. I lifted up the steel latch of the door and propped up the latch with the smaller of the 2 candles, one end of which was on the middle socket and the other beneath the latch. The heat of the room, I knew, would still further soften the candle and let the latch down in a short time. I was prepared for the telephone by his bedside, though I did not know to whither it led. The presence of the paper knife decided me. I balanced it across the silver cigarette box so that one end came under the telephone receiver. Under the other end, I put the second candle, which I had to cut to fit. On top of the paper knife at the candle end, I balanced the only 2 books I could find in the room, and fortunately they were heavy. I had no means of knowing how long it would take to melt the candle to a state of flexion which would allow the full weight of the books to bear upon the candle end of the paper knife and fling off the receiver. I was hoping that Fisher had taken my warning and gone. When I opened the door softly, I heard his footsteps in the hall below. There was nothing to do but to finish the play. I turned and addressed an imaginary conversation to Kara. It was horrible, but there was something about it which aroused in me a curious sense of humor, and I wanted to laugh and laugh and laugh. I heard the man coming up the stairs and closed the door gingerly. What length of time would it take for the candle to bend? To completely establish the alibi, I determined to hold Fisher in conversation, and this was all the easier since apparently he had not seen the envelope I had left on the table downstairs. I had not long to wait, for suddenly with a crash, I heard the steel latch fall in its place. Under the effect of the heat, the candle had bent sooner than I had expected. I asked Fisher what was the meaning of the sound, and he explained. I passed down the stairs, talking all the time. I found a cab at Sloane Square and drove to my lodgings. Underneath my overcoat, I was partly dressed in evening kit. 10 minutes after I entered the door of my flat, I came out a beardless man about town, not to be distinguished from the 1,000 others who would be found that night walking the promenade of any of the great music halls. From Victoria Street, I drove straight to Scotland Yard. It was no more than a coincidence that whilst I should have been speaking with you all, the second candle should have bent and the alarm be given in the very office in which I was sitting. I assure you all in all earnestness that I did not suspect the cause of that ringing until Mr. Mansus spoke. There, gentlemen, is my story. He threw out his arms. You may do with me as you will. Kara was a murderer, died 100 times in innocent blood. I have done all that I set myself to do. That and no more. That and no less. I had thought of it to go away to America, but the nearer the day of my departure approached, the more vivid became the memory of the plans which she and I had formed. My girl, my poor, martyred girl. He sat at the little table, his hands clasped before him, his face lined and white. And that is the end, he said suddenly, with a wry smile. Not quite. TX swung round with a gasp. It was Belinda Mary who spoke. I can carry it on, she said. She was wonderfully self-possessed, thought TX. But then TX never thought anything of her but that she was wonderfully something or the other. Most of your story is true, Mr. Lexman, said this astonishing girl, oblivious of the amazed eyes that were staring at her. But Kara deceived you in one respect. What do you mean? Asked John Lexman, rising unsteadily to his feet. For answer, she rose and walked back to the door with the chintz curtains and flung it open. There was a wait which seemed an eternity, and then through the doorway came a girl, slim and grave and beautiful. My God, whispered TX. Grace Lexman. Let's see. There's only one short chapter left. I know we're a little over time, but I figure we go ahead and finish the book. Chapter 23. They went out and left them alone. Two people who found in this moment a heaven which is not beyond the reach of humanity, but which is seldom attained to. Belinda Mary had an eager audience all to her very self. Of course she didn't die, she said scornfully. Kara was playing on his fears all the time. He never even harmed her, in the way Mr. Lexman feared. He told Mrs. Lexman that her husband was dead, just as he told John Lexman his wife was gone. What happened was that he brought her back to England. Who? Asked TX incredulously. Grace Lexman, said the girl, with a smile. You wouldn't think it possible, but when you realized that he had a yacht of his own and that he could travel up from whatever landing place he chose to his house in Cadogan Square by motor car, and that he could take her straight away into his cellar without disturbing his household, you'll understand that the only difficulty he had was in landing her. It was in the lower cellar that I found her. You found her in the cellar? Demanded the chief commissioner. The girl nodded. I found her and the dog. You heard how Kara terrified her, and I killed the dog with my own hands, she said a little proudly, and then shivered. It was very beastly, she admitted. And she's been living with you all this time, and you've said nothing, asked TX incredulously. Belinda Mary nodded. And that is why you didn't want me to know where you were living? She nodded again. You see, she was very ill, she said, and I had to nurse her up. And of course I knew that it was Lexman who had killed Kara, and I couldn't tell you about Grace Lexman without betraying him. So when Mr. Lexman decided to tell his story, I thought I'd better supply the grand denouement. The men looked at one another. What are you going to do about Lexman? Asked the chief commissioner. And by the way, TX, how does all this fit your theories? Fairly well, replied TX coolly. Obviously the man who committed the murder was the man introduced into the room as Gathercole, and as obviously was not Gathercole, although to all appearance he had lost his left arm. Why obvious? Asked the chief commissioner. Because, answered TX Meredith, the real Gathercole had lost his right arm. That was the one error Lexman made. The chief pulled his mustache and looked inquiringly round the room. We have to make up our minds very quickly about Lexman, he said. What do you think, Carl knew? The Frenchman shrugged his shoulders. For my part, I should not only importune your Home Secretary to pardon him, but I should recommend him for a pension, he said flippantly. What do you think, Savorsky? The Russian smiled a little. It is a very impressive story, he said dispassionately. It occurs to me that if you intend bringing your Mr. Lexman to judgment, you are likely to expose some very pretty scandals. Incidentally, he said, stroking his trim little mustache, I might remark that any exposure which drew attention to the lawless conditions of Albania would not be regarded by my government with favor. The chief commissioner's eyes twinkled and he nodded. That is also my view, said the chief of the Italian bureau. Naturally, we are greatly interested in all that happens on the Adriatic littoral. It seems to me that Kara has come to a very merciful end, and I am not inclined to regard a prosecution of Mr. Lexman with equanimity. Well, I guess the political aspect of the case doesn't affect us very much, said O'Grady. But as one who was once mighty near asphyxiated by stirring up the wrong kind of mud, I should leave the matter where it is. The chief commissioner was deep in thought, and Belinda Mary eyed him anxiously. Tell them to come in, he said bluntly. The girl went and brought John Lexman and his wife, and they came in hand, supremely and serenely happy, whatever the future might hold for them. The chief commissioner cleared his throat. Lexman, we're all very much obliged to you, he said, for a very interesting story and a most interesting theory. What you have done, as I understand the matter, he proceeded deliberately, is to put yourself in the murderer's place and advance a theory not only as to how the murder was actually committed, but as to the motive for that murder. It is, I might say, a remarkable piece of reconstruction. He spoke very deliberately, and swept away John Lexman's astonished interruption with a stern hand. Please wait, and do not speak until I am out of hearing, he growled. You have got into the skin of the actual assassin, and have spoken most convincingly. One might almost think that the man who killed Remington Kara was actually standing before us. For that piece of impersonation we are all very grateful. He glared round over his spectacles at his understanding colleagues, and they murmured approvingly. He looked at his watch. Now, I am afraid I must be off. He crossed the room and put out his hand to John Lexman. I wish you good luck, he said, and took both Grace Lexman's hands in his. One of these days, he said paternally, I shall come down to Best and Tracy, and your husband shall tell me another and happier story. He paused at the door as he was going out, and looking back, caught the grateful eyes of Lexman. By the way, Mr. Lexman, he said hesitatingly, I don't think I should ever write a story called The Clue of the Twisted Candle, if I were you. John Lexman shook his head. It will never be written, he said, by me. A little bit of a meta twist there at the end of that, implying that the author just wrote what Lexman related to him. I am still a little bit mad that we waited 13 chapters till we got to the actual murder mystery. It is a little funny that our innocent victim turned out to be the murderer in the end. What'd you guys think of the story? Yep. Just yep. Oh, that doesn't tell me much. I wonder who's streaming. Alex, are you still here? Are you streaming, my friend? No, looks like Alex is offline. Well, Lady Luna Star, we rated her a while back. She was painting. She is streaming. We could go raid her. This is different. Do you guys want another like mystery story next week? You don't have to decide now. You can talk about it in the Discord and let me know what you think. But we are going to have to pick a new book. If you're open to other genres, I think there's a couple of things in the book request channel I could probably get to. We could try out one of those. Ah, yep, was for Meta. Gotcha. Yeah, there's a little bit of a time delay both in what you hear from me and what I get back from you. So it's not much because I haven't set up a time delay. It's just whatever comes from the delay streaming and processing the stuff and all that. But let's go raid Lady Luna Star. Go see some art. She's painting. I'm not sure what it is. It looks cool though. Hey Carol, you caught me just as we're ending, unless you've been here for about a while. All right. Well, we are off to go raid an art stream. Well, I'm glad you've been here. I'm glad you caught the stream, Carol. Next time, you'll have to say hi sooner. I hope you enjoyed it. All right. Well, let's head out on the raid. And Carol, if you're not in the Discord, you should totally join the Discord and come chat with us. And let us know if you have any thoughts on what to read next. In any case, away we go. All right, I will catch all of you, well, the subscribers tomorrow and the rest of you Friday. Have a good one.